Izuku Midoriya had known since he was 4 years old that he would never manifest a quirk. The doctor had said it plainly, the way doctors said things when they had delivered the same news too many times to soften it anymore. An extra joint in his toes, a bone structure that matched every documented quirkless case on record. Inko Midoriya had cried in the waiting room while her son sat beside her, swinging his feet, not yet understanding what the tears meant. By the time he was old enough to understand, the tears made perfect sense. Being quirkless in a world where 80% of the population had some manner of superhuman ability was not a small inconvenience. It was a verdict. Teachers stopped calling on him during quirk demonstration days. Classmates stopped inviting him to games that required abilities he did not have. And Katsuki Bakugo, the boy who had once been his best friend, stopped seeing him as anything but a weight tied to his own ambitions. "You think someone like you could ever be a hero?" Katsuki had asked him once, years ago, standing over a small koi pond with his friends laughing behind him. "Quit dreaming, Deku. Some of us were born to win. You were born to lose." Izuku had gone home that day and cried into his notebook, the one where he catalogued every hero's quirk in careful, obsessive detail. But he had not stopped writing in it. He had not stopped dreaming. If anything, the notebook grew thicker with each passing year, filled with analysis of movement patterns, strength calculations, hypothetical training regimens for a body that might never need them. His mother worried about that notebook more than she let on. She worried about the quiet way her son absorbed every insult and turned it inward instead of outward. She worried about the flinch that had crept into his shoulders whenever Katsuki's group rounded a corner. But she never once told him to give up the dream, even when giving up would have been easier for both of them. "You are the kindest boy I know," she told him one evening, when he was 12 and had come home with a scraped knee he refused to explain. "That has to count for something, Izuku." "It has to." He wanted to believe her. Some nights he did. Other nights, watching footage of All Might smashing through villains with that easy, radiant grin, he felt the gap between himself and his hero widen into something that looked less like distance and more like a wall. What none of them knew, not Izuku, not his mother, not even the doctors who had run every scan available to modern medicine, was that the wall was not empty space. Something lived behind it. Not a quirk in the conventional sense, nothing that would have shown up on a standard scan, but a dormant thread of potential so deeply buried that it had evaded detection entirely, waiting for a trigger violent enough to shake it loose. That trigger came on an ordinary afternoon in his 3rd year of middle school, in a drainage culvert that smelled of stagnant water and rust, when a villain made of living sludge poured itself over Katsuki Bakugo's mouth and began forcing its way down his throat. Izuku had been walking home with his notebook clutched to his chest, rehearsing hero commentary under his breath the way he always did, when the manhole cover beside him burst upward in a spray of filth. He should have run. Every survival instinct told him to run. His body did not listen. His body had already started moving toward the fight before his mind finished processing what it was seeing. He told himself later that it was reflex, that anyone would have thrown their backpack, that anyone would have screamed for help while grabbing for anything solid to swing. He believed that story for a long time. It was easier than believing the truth, which was that something ancient and coiled deep inside his cells had recognized danger to another person and simply refused to remain dormant any longer. The sludge villain laughed, a wet, bubbling sound, and backhanded him into a concrete wall hard enough to crack it. Pain exploded through Izuku's ribs. He tasted blood. And in that instant, something in his chest ignited, a heat that had no origin point he could name, spreading outward through his arms and into his clenched fists like a furnace given form. He did not decide to punch the villain. He simply did, and where an ordinary quirkless punch would have splashed harmlessly through liquid muscle, this one connected with a concussive force that sent sludge and glass and gravel scattering in a 10-meter radius. The villain shrieked, losing cohesion, and Katsuki dropped to the pavement gasping for air. By the time All Might arrived, following the tremor of that impact through 3 city blocks, the villain had already been driven off, fleeing into a storm drain rather than face whatever had just hit it. All Might found a boy sitting on the cracked pavement, staring at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else, and a boy beside him coughing up the last of the sludge, cursing every deity he could name. Young man, All Might said, crouching down to Izuku's level, his voice quieter than the news cameras had ever captured it. What exactly did you just do? I don't know, Izuku whispered, and it was the honest truth. I've never been able to do that before. I'm quirkless. I've always been quirkless. All Might studied him for a long moment, the kind of scrutiny that felt like being weighed on some invisible scale. Around them, the first police cars were arriving, officers fanning out to secure the scene and take statements from the shaken bystanders who had witnessed the fight from a safe distance. Katsuki sat against the cracked wall a few meters away, still catching his breath, staring at Izuku with an expression that mixed disbelief and something else he did not yet have words for. Then All Might did something that surprised them both. He offered his hand and helped Izuku to his feet, careful of the boy's bruised ribs. Nothing about what I just witnessed reads as quirkless, All Might said. I have spent 30 years studying human ability in every form it takes. What lives inside you, young man, is real. It is simply unclaimed. That is a very different thing from absent. The hospital ran every test again. The results came back identical to every previous scan of Izuku Midoriya's body, no quirk factor, no active gene expression, nothing that modern quirkology recognized as the physical signature of an ability. And yet the security footage from the drainage culvert did not lie. Neither did the crater in the concrete or the 11 witnesses who had seen a supposedly quirkless boy send a villain fleeing with a single blow. All Might visited the Midoriya apartment 3 days later, out of costume, introducing himself simply as Toshinori Yagi, a retired pro hero doing informal research on unusual quirk manifestations. Inko nearly fainted when she recognized the gaunt, hollow-cheeked man as the symbol of peace himself, stripped of the muscle that made him legendary. Your son has something rare, Toshinori told her, once tea had been poured and nerves had settled enough for conversation. I have encountered only a handful of cases like it in my career. A latent ability, present from birth, but suppressed so deeply that it produces no detectable signature until triggered by extreme circumstance. The medical community does not have a name for it yet. I have taken to calling it a hidden power, for lack of anything more precise. Is it dangerous? Inko asked, her hands wrapped tight around her cup. What he did to that villain, the doctor said the impact force was consistent with a professional hero's finishing blow, Toshinori finished gently. Yes. It is powerful. Power without training is always dangerous, Mrs. Midoriya, to the user as much as to anyone around them. That is precisely why I am here. He turned to Izuku, who had not said a word since the retired hero arrived, too overwhelmed to trust his own voice. I would like to train you. Properly, safely, with full understanding of what you are working with. Not because I am obligated to. Because I think, if given the chance, you could become an extraordinary hero. The kind this era needs. Izuku's notebook fell out of his lap. He did not notice. Me? You want to train me? I have watched a great many people move through danger in my career, Toshinori said. Most of them move to protect themselves first. You move to protect someone who has, from what I have gathered, been unkind to you for a very long time. That tells me more about your character than any test could. The training began the following week, before dawn, on a stretch of coastline littered with decades of illegally dumped garbage. Toshinori explained the terms honestly. The hidden power responded to will and emotional intensity more than physical technique, which made it simultaneously easier and more dangerous to develop than a conventional quirk. Untrained, it would continue to surge only in moments of crisis, uncontrollable and liable to injure Izuku as badly as his enemies. Trained, it could become something he commanded rather than something that commanded him. We start by building the body that can hold it, Toshinori said, gesturing at the mountain of refuse stretching down the beach. Clear this, and you will have built both the muscle and the mental discipline the power demands. It will take months. Do not expect results before then. Izuku did not complain. He hauled rusted refrigerators and shattered furniture and tangled fishing nets from dawn until his mother called him in for school, then returned every evening until the sun went down. His hands blistered and scarred. His body, once soft and unremarkable, began to change beneath the punishing regimen, though the true transformation was happening somewhere less visible, in the pathways connecting will to ability. 6 months in, standing ankle-deep in surf with the last of the beach's garbage finally hauled away, Izuku attempted his first deliberate activation. Toshinori stood 20 meters off, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. Focus on the sensation from the culvert, Toshinori instructed. Not the fear. The moment after, when you decided to act despite it. Izuku closed his eyes and remembered Katsuki choking, remembered the decision that had not felt like a decision at all, more like a door swinging open inside him that had always been there, simply locked. He reached for that door now, consciously, and felt heat bloom through his chest exactly as it had before, except this time it did not startle him into blind action. This time he held it, shaped it, let it settle into his clenched right fist like a coal banked for burning. He struck a boulder half buried in the sand. It did not explode into rubble the way the concrete wall had. It cracked cleanly down the middle and split in two, controlled, deliberate, exactly as much force as he had intended and not a fraction more. Toshinori's grin, when Izuku turned to him, was the widest he had shown since their first meeting. There it is, he said. There is the beginning of a hero. The UA High School entrance exam arrived on a cold morning in early spring, and Izuku stood outside the towering gates with 1,000 other hopefuls, his stomach twisted into knots that had nothing to do with the chill. Toshinori had trained him for 10 months. 10 months of grueling physical conditioning, of learning to summon and release the hidden power in controlled bursts, of studying the exam's practical format until he could recite the scoring system in his sleep. None of it stopped the fear that he would freeze the moment it mattered. The written portion passed in a blur of familiar material, easy after a childhood spent obsessively studying hero theory. The practical exam was where everything would be decided, 10 minutes turned loose in a mock city against robotic villains worth points based on their threat rating. Izuku moved through the course with more confidence than he expected, cracking apart a 2-point bot with a single strike, dodging a 3-pointer's swinging arm and countering with a blow that sent it crashing through a storefront facade. He had cleared enough points to qualify twice over when the ground began to shake in a way none of the smaller robots explained. A 0-pointer, the massive, building-sized machine included in the exam purely as an obstacle rather than a scoring target, rounded a corner and bore down on a girl who had fallen, her leg pinned beneath rubble from an earlier collapse. Izuku recognized her from the written exam waiting room, a girl with warm brown eyes who had wished him luck before they were separated into testing groups. He did not remember deciding to run toward the 0-pointer instead of away from it. He simply found himself sprinting, the hidden power surging hot through his veins as the machine's shadow fell across them both. Get back! He shouted at her, though there was no time for her to obey. He planted his feet, drew back his fist, and released everything he had trained 10 months to control, holding nothing in reserve. The blow connected with the machine's descending arm and stopped it cold, the impact rippling outward in a shockwave that cracked the pavement for meters in every direction and sent Izuku himself flying backward from the recoil, his own arm fractured in 3 places from the strain of channeling that much force through an 18-year-old frame not yet fully accustomed to its own potential. He hit the ground hard enough to black out the edges of his vision, but he was smiling when the girl reached him, her face pale with worry, apologizing over and over for something that had never been her fault. Don't apologize, he managed, through the pain radiating up his arm. That's what heroes do. We just do it. Her name, he learned as the exam proctors carried him toward medical attention, was Ochako Uraraka, and she thanked him with such genuine warmth that he found himself grinning despite the fractures, despite the exhaustion, despite everything. The acceptance letter arrived 2 weeks later in the form of a video message from a small, mouse-like hero named Mizu, who informed Izuku that his practical exam score, while modest on paper due to time lost in the final minutes, had been supplemented by an entirely separate category of points awarded for rescue actions, a category most examinees never triggered at all. Combined, the scores placed him comfortably within UA's incoming hero course. Izuku watched the message 4 times before he believed it was real. Then he ran to find his mother, who was already crying before he said a word, because she had heard his shout of joy through 2 closed doors and known exactly what it meant. That night, sitting at his desk with his notebook open to a fresh page, Izuku wrote a single line at the top before closing it for the evening. Not a quirk analysis. Not a hero ranking. Just 4 words, underlined twice. This is only the beginning. Toshinori called that evening to offer his congratulations, along with a piece of advice Izuku would carry with him long after the conversation ended. You have spent your whole life being told what you are not, the retired hero said. UA will not care what you are not. It will only care what you choose to become. Choose well, young Midoriya. I believe in you. Class 1A's homeroom on the first day of the term was a study in barely contained chaos, 20 students trying to make sense of a teacher who introduced himself by threatening immediate expulsion and then made good on a milder version of that threat within the hour. Izuku sat near the window with his arm still in a light brace, listening to Shota Aizawa explain the concept of a quirk assessment test with the flat, unimpressed tone of a man who had delivered the same speech to 100 previous classes. Whoever comes in last in overall scoring will be judged to have no potential and expelled on the spot, Aizawa said, and the room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees despite the morning sun through the windows. Izuku's stomach dropped. He had trained for 10 months, but he had trained for combat scenarios, for controlled release of the hidden power under pressure. He had never trained for a standardized battery of grip strength tests and 50-meter dashes measured against classmates who had spent their entire lives optimizing quirks built for exactly that kind of measurement. The girl beside him seemed to sense his tension. She was tall, with dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail and an air of quiet, thoughtful composure that made her seem older than the rest of the nervous teenagers filing out toward the field. You're the one who broke his arm stopping the exam robot, she said, not quite a question. I read about it in the incident report recovery girl filed. That takes real conviction, doing something like that on instinct. I didn't really think about it, Izuku admitted, flustered by the directness of her attention. I just moved. That is precisely what conviction looks like, she said, extending a hand with the formal poise of someone raised to make proper introductions. Momo Yaoyorozu. My quirk allows me to create objects from my own body's lipid reserves, provided I understand their full molecular composition. It rewards study rather than raw output, so I understand something of what it means to rely on preparation over instinct. Izuku shook her hand, momentarily forgetting his own name in the face of such an eloquent introduction, before stammering it out a beat too late. Momo's small smile suggested she found the delay endearing rather than awkward. The quirk assessment tests that followed were, true to Aizawa's warning, brutal in their honesty. Izuku's grip strength score was unremarkable. His 50-meter dash, average. But when the softball throw came around, when he was permitted to channel the hidden power into a single controlled release, the ball left his hand with a crack of displaced air and did not stop climbing until it had cleared the school's outer wall entirely, the measuring device reporting a distance that made half the class turn to stare at him. Infinity, Aizawa read from the display, his expression unchanging but his eyes lingering on Izuku a moment longer than strictly necessary. Interesting. Not every event favored him so cleanly. The long-distance run, requiring sustained output rather than a single burst, left him gasping at the back of the pack, and the standing long jump revealed the same limitation, a power built for explosive force rather than endurance. By the final tally, he had placed solidly in the middle of the class, safely clear of Aizawa's expulsion threat, which the homeroom teacher revealed afterward had never actually been intended for anyone that day. A frog-faced girl who introduced herself as Tsuyu Asui found him afterward, sitting on the field with his knees pulled up, still processing the whirlwind of the day. You looked worried during the ball throw, Ribbit, she observed, settling beside him without waiting for an invitation. But your face after was the happiest I've seen anyone look all day. Do you always feel things that intensely? I think I do, Izuku admitted, surprised by how easy it was to answer her honestly. I spent a long time not being able to feel much except worried that I'd never measure up. Now that I actually can, I guess it comes out kind of loud. I don't think that's a bad thing, Tsuyu said, with the same flat, considering tone she seemed to apply to everything. Most heroes hide what they feel until it curdles into something worse. You should keep doing it your way. A third voice joined them before Izuku could respond, bright and effervescent, trailing the scent of something sweet that he would later learn was a side effect of her quirk's acid secretions. Hey, you're the guy who cracked a boulder with one punch during training footage. Present Mike showed us, right? That's so cool. I'm Mina Ashido, and honestly I've been dying to ask someone what it actually feels like to hit something that hard. Izuku found himself laughing for what felt like the first time in years without a trace of self-consciousness behind it, surrounded by 3 classmates who had decided, apparently without much deliberation, that he was worth knowing. It was such a small thing, 3 names, and 3 warm expressions turned toward him instead of away, but it settled into his chest with a weight that felt suspiciously like the beginning of something he had never quite let himself hope for. The unforeseen simulation joint, UA's flagship disaster training facility, was meant to be Izuku's first real taste of coordinated rescue work, a controlled environment where Class 1A would rotate through zones simulating floods, fires, landslides, and collapsed buildings under the supervision of the Hero 13. It was not meant to become the site of a genuine villain incursion, but the swirling black portal that opened in the facility's central plaza cared nothing for what the day was meant to be. Dozens of villains poured through, led by a hand-covered figure who called himself Shigaraki and a massive, muscle-bound brute whose presence alone seemed to warp the air around him. Aizawa dropped into the plaza to engage them directly, buying time, while the students scattered across the facility's zones found themselves cut off from the exit and from each other, separated by design rather than accident. Izuku found himself in the flood zone alongside Tsuyu and Momo when 3 villains dropped down from the observation deck above, cutting off the only path back toward the central plaza. His pulse spiked, the hidden power surging reflexively hot through his chest, but he held it in check, remembering Toshinori's endless drilling on restraint over raw output. There is no path around them, Momo said, already running calculations aloud in the clipped, precise way she processed pressure. But there may be a path through, if we coordinate rather than engage individually. I can slow them in the water, Tsuyu offered, gesturing at the flooded arena around them. My frog abilities work better here than theirs will. Give me an opening and I can pull at least one under before they realize what's happening. Izuku nodded, already tracking the villains' positions, the way Toshinori had taught him to read a hostile crowd for its weakest coordination point. The one on the left keeps checking behind him. He's nervous, probably new. If I take him first, the other 2 lose their anchor. They moved together with an instinct that felt remarkable given how recently they had met, Momo materializing a length of reinforced cable to bind the villain Tsuyu dragged beneath the surface, Izuku closing the distance on the nervous one and ending the confrontation with a single restrained blow that cracked pavement rather than bone, careful even now, even afraid, to hold back exactly as much force as the situation required and no more. The 3rd villain broke and fled rather than face what remained of the trio, and the 3 of them stood in the receding water, breathing hard, exchanging a look that carried more relief and triumph. That was good, Tsuyu said simply. We should remember how that felt, Ribbit. Working like that. They found the rest of Class 1A converging on the central plaza in time to see All Might arrive in a blur of golden light, the villain incursion collapsing as quickly as it had begun in the face of the number 1 hero's overwhelming presence. Shigaraki retreated through his portal cursing, the muscular brute dragged along behind him, and the facility fell quiet except for the distant wail of emergency sirens finally cutting through the barrier that had been jamming outside communication. In the aftermath, while paramedics checked over students for injuries and Aizawa gave a statement to the arriving pro-heroes, Izuku sat on the plaza steps with Momo on one side and Tsuyu on the other, Mina jogging over from where her own group had weathered the fire zone's chaos to drop down beside them with theatrical exhaustion. Okay, first week and we already survived an actual villain attack, Mina said, flopping backward onto the concrete. I feel like that should come with some kind of bonus credit. I would settle for a quiet week after this, Momo admitted, allowing herself a rare moment of visible fatigue now that the danger had passed. Izuku looked around at the 3 of them, at the easy way they had folded him into their circle without hesitation or condition, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched tight since he was 4 years old and a doctor had told his mother he would never be anything special. He still did not know exactly what he had become, only that whatever it was, it felt less lonely with people like these beside him. The announcement of UA's sports festival sent a current of nervous energy through Class 1A that lingered for a full week before the event itself. It was, Aizawa reminded them without much sentimentality, the single largest public platform most of them would ever stand on as students, watched by millions and scouted by every pro agency in the country. Careers had been launched or quietly buried based on a single festival performance. Izuku spent his evenings in the gym rather than sleeping, refining his control over the hidden power under the increasingly demanding eye of a training menu Toshinori had drawn up specifically for the festival's likely obstacle formats. Momo joined him more evenings than not, less out of any romantic pretense and more because she genuinely enjoyed the problem of optimizing an unconventional ability, sketching diagrams of force distribution in the margins of her notebook while he ran drills. "Your output ceiling is remarkable," she told him one evening, reviewing her calculations. "But your control curve between minimum and maximum force is too steep. There is very little middle ground between a restrained tap and a devastating blow. If you can smooth that curve, you gain an entire range of options currently close to you. How would I even start doing that?" Izuku asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Incrementally," Momo said, already sketching a training progression. "Small, deliberate steps between extremes, repeated until they become instinct rather than calculation. I would be glad to help you design the drills, if you would find that useful." He found it more than useful. He found, somewhere in those quiet evening sessions, that he looked forward to her company as much as the training itself, though he was careful not to examine that feeling too closely with the festival looming. The festival opened with an obstacle race through a winding, hazard-laden course that funneled all 100 first-year students through a single narrow gauntlet at once. Izuku used the hidden power sparingly at the start, conserving his reserves, but broke free of the crowded pack halfway through by punching a controlled fissure into the ground beneath a cluster of leading students, using the resulting instability to vault past them entirely without directly harming anyone. He crossed into the top 10, breathing hard but grinning. The cavalry battle that followed paired students into small teams competing for headbands worth points based on rank, and Izuku found himself designated the highest value target in the entire event, his own hidden headband worth an absurd 10 million points as a direct consequence of his obstacle race performance. Every team in the stadium turned toward him within seconds of the whistle blowing. He had expected to face that pressure alone. Instead, Mina slid into his cavalry formation at the last possible moment, grabbing two other willing classmates to round out a defensive square around him, her acid quirk proving unexpectedly effective at creating slick, unstable ground beneath the feet of any team attempting to close the distance. "Figured you'd need backup," she said, grinning fiercely as she dissolved the approach path of a rival team into treacherous slush. 10 million points is way too big a target for one guy to guard alone. They survived the full 15 minutes, battered and exhausted, headband intact, advancing together into the tournament bracket that would decide the festival's individual champion. Izuku's first-round match paired him against a boy whose quirk manipulated gravity, a difficult matchup that stretched nearly to the time limit before Izuku found the narrow opening he needed, timing a controlled burst of the hidden power to shatter the arena floor beneath his opponent's feet and force a ring out. He advanced through 2 more rounds before finally meeting his match in the semi-final against a girl whose quirk generated impenetrable, adjustable hardened skin, a defense his raw striking power simply could not crack no matter how precisely he calibrated it. He lost, cleanly and without shame, extending his hand afterward with genuine respect rather than bitterness. That night, Class 1A gathered in a private corner of the dormitory common room, tired and sunburned and thoroughly pleased with a day that had exceeded most of their expectations. Momo found him near the window, watching the lingering festival lights still glowing across the distant stadium. "You did remarkably well," she said, settling beside him. "For someone who was, by his own account, quirkless less than a year ago." "I had good training," Izuku said, glancing sideways at her with a small, honest smile. "And good people around me, helping without asking for anything back. That matters more than the training, I think." Momo did not answer immediately, but the warmth in her expression as she watched the stadium lights fade said more than words might have. The internship offers arrived in the weeks following the sports festival, a flood of physical cards bearing agency letterheads that spread across the classroom floor when Aizawa dumped them unceremoniously onto Izuku's desk. He stared at the pile in open disbelief, certain some clerical error had produced this many offers for a student who had not even reached the final bracket of the festival tournament. "Your semi-final loss did not hurt your visibility," Aizawa said, unmoved by the astonishment on Izuku's face. "If anything, agencies respect a fighter who loses well more than one who wins ugly. Choose carefully." Your first internship shapes how the industry perceives you for years afterward. After considerable deliberation, and no small amount of research into agency philosophies that filled several fresh pages of his notebook, Izuku accepted an offer from a mid-sized rescue-focused agency known for prioritizing civilian safety over flashy combat footage, a hero named Edshot whose precision and restraint mirrored the values Toshinori had spent a year instilling in him. Momo, Tsuyu, and Mina each pursued their own internships that same week, scattered across different agencies but reconvening every evening in the dormitory to compare notes, exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure by their first genuine taste of professional hero work. Izuku's days with Edshot involved less punching than he had expected and far more patient observation, learning to read a crowd for the earliest signs of panic, to position himself for maximum rescue efficiency rather than maximum visible impact. Power without positioning is wasted potential, Edshot told him during a quiet afternoon patrol, echoing a philosophy that felt like a natural extension of everything Toshinori had already taught him. You have more raw strength than most heroes twice your age. Learn where to stand, and that strength will save far more lives than it ever will in a headline fight. The lesson proved itself sooner than either of them expected, during a routine patrol through a crowded shopping district that turned suddenly chaotic when a gas line ruptured beneath a construction site, sending flame and debris scattering across a plaza full of afternoon shoppers. Edshot moved to contain the fire spread while Izuku, remembering every word of positioning advice from the past weeks, threw himself toward the collapsing scaffolding threatening a cluster of trapped pedestrians. He caught the falling steel beam with both arms, the hidden power flooding through him in a controlled, sustained burst rather than the single explosive strike he had spent months mastering, holding the impossible weight steady long enough for every trapped civilian to scramble clear. His arms shook with the strain by the time Edshot finally reached him to help ease the beam down safely, but he had held, and no one beneath it had been harmed. News coverage of the incident spread quickly, a grainy phone video of the quirkless boy turned unexpected powerhouse holding steel with his bare hands circulating widely enough that Class 1A greeted him with a mixture of pride and good-natured teasing when he returned to the dormitory that evening. You're basically famous now, Mina announced, shoving her phone screen toward him. Look, they're calling you the hidden power hero online already. People are already inventing your hero name for you. That's a little premature, Izuku said, flushing at the attention, though he could not quite keep the pleased smile off his face. Premature or not, you earned it, Tsuyu said, settling into the couch beside him with her usual unhurried calm. Not many first years pull civilians out from under falling steel during their very first internship, ribbit. Momo, who had returned from her own internship only an hour earlier, offered him a small, genuine smile from across the common room, one that lingered a fraction longer than casual conversation strictly required. I am glad you are safe, she said quietly, before the rest of the class's chatter swallowed the moment. Truly glad. Izuku carried that quiet sentence with him long after the room had settled into its usual evening rhythm, turning it over in his thoughts the way he once turned over hero statistics in his notebook, searching for meaning in every detail. Something was shifting, subtly but unmistakably, in the space between training drills and shared dormitory evenings, though he was not yet sure he had the courage to name what it was. Second term brought harder training and heavier expectations, the faculty's collective attention sharpening as the provisional hero license exam loomed on the horizon, a milestone that would determine which students earned the legal right to use their quirks in real combat situations outside supervised school settings. Failure meant another full year of restricted training. Success meant the first true step toward the professional world Izuku had dreamed about since he was 4 years old. He threw himself into preparation with the same relentless focus that had carried him through every challenge since the sludge villain incident, splitting his evenings between physical conditioning and the growing study group that had assembled almost organically around him. Momo, Tsuyu, and Mina joined most nights by a handful of other classmates eager to benefit from Momo's meticulous notes and Izuku's obsessive knowledge of hero regulation and rescue protocol. You could teach this material better than half our actual instructors, Mina told him one evening, only half joking, after he had spent 20 uninterrupted minutes explaining the legal nuances of civilian evacuation priority without once glancing at a reference text. I just really like understanding how things work, Izuku admitted, a little embarrassed by the praise. It helps me feel less like I'm just guessing when it actually matters. It shows, Tsuyu said. You explain things the way someone explains something they love, ribbit. Not the way someone recites something they memorized. The exam itself unfolded across 2 grueling days, a written portion testing legal and procedural knowledge followed by a practical trial that placed examinees into simulated disaster scenarios monitored by a panel of veteran pro-heroes. Izuku's assigned scenario dropped him into a collapsed apartment complex populated by robotic stand-ins for trapped civilians, a scenario that rewarded methodical, careful rescue work over raw destructive power, exactly the kind of test his months with Ed Shot had prepared him for without either of them quite planning it that way. He passed with a score that placed him among the top-scoring examinees in the entire nationwide pool, a fact confirmed a week later in a formal ceremony where he stood alongside Momo, Tsuyu, and Mina, all 4 of them now legally licensed to act as heroes under appropriate supervision, a milestone none of them fully believed until the provisional license cards were physically pressed into their hands. That evening, the 4 of them found themselves alone on the dormitory rooftop, having slipped away from the class's larger celebration in search of quieter air, the city lights spreading out beneath them in a soft, glittering carpet that Izuku still found himself in disbelief he got to call the view from his own school. "A year ago I was quirkless," he said quietly, more to the skyline than to any of them specifically. "I used to stand at my window at home and watch pro-heroes on the news and think I'd never be anything but someone watching from the outside. And now I'm standing up here with an actual license in my pocket, next to people who actually believed in me before I fully believed in myself." "That's what found family does," Mina said simply, bumping her shoulder against his. "Believes in you until you catch up." "You were never someone watching from the outside," Momo said, her voice softer than her usual measured tone. "Even when your ability was hidden, the will behind it was never in question. Anyone paying close attention could see that." Tsuyu said nothing, but she settled comfortably against the rooftop railing beside them, content in the easy silence that followed, the 4 of them watching the city glow beneath a sky just beginning to fill with stars. Somewhere out there, Izuku knew, real danger still waited, villains and disasters and challenges he could not yet predict. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not face that unknown future alone, and that made all the difference in the world. Below them, unseen, a letter had already arrived at the school administration office. One Aizawa would not open until the following morning, informing UA that a coalition of villains scattered by the earlier USJ incident had regrouped under new leadership, and that their next target had been identified as an upcoming public hero event less than a month away. The quiet rooftop evening would not last forever. But for tonight, beneath a sky full of stars and surrounded by people who had chosen him without condition, Izuku allowed himself simply to be happy. A rare free Saturday arrived in the gap between the license ceremony and the start of summer training camp, and Class 1A scattered across the city in small groups eager to spend a day free of drills and deadlines. Izuku had intended to spend the morning quietly reviewing his notes, a habit his friends had gently begun trying to interrupt whenever they caught him at it on a day meant for rest. Tsuyu found him first, appearing at his dormitory door with a small cooler bag and an expression of patient determination that suggested she had no intention of accepting a refusal. "There's a pond 2 train stops from here," she said. "Good for catching things, better for sitting quietly. You look like you need both today, ribbit." He went, more out of curiosity than conviction, and found that Tsuyu's idea of a relaxing outing involved long stretches of comfortable silence interrupted only by her occasional, deadpan observations about the local wildlife. It was, he realized somewhere around midday, exactly the kind of rest his overactive mind rarely allowed itself, and he left the pond that afternoon feeling lighter than he had in weeks. "You worry too much about being enough," Tsuyu told him as they walked back toward the train station, apropos of nothing he had said aloud. "I've noticed it since the first week of class. You don't have to prove anything to us anymore, Izuku. You already have." He did not have a ready answer for that, but he carried the words with him for the rest of the day, turning them over the way he turned over difficult training concepts, searching for the moment he might finally believe them without reservation. Mina claimed the evening, dragging him along with Momo to a small night market that had sprung up near the school's outer district, insisting that neither of them had properly experienced the city outside of training routes and hero business. She moved through the crowded stalls with an infectious enthusiasm that made even Momo's usual composure crack into genuine laughter more than once, sampling foods neither of them had tried before and narrating each reaction with theatrical commentary. "See, this is important," Mina announced, handing Izuku something wrapped in paper that smelled sweet and unfamiliar. "You can't be a well-rounded hero if all you know is training menus and rescue protocol. Heroes need to understand the people they're protecting, and that means knowing what makes a Saturday night actually fun for regular people." "I don't disagree with the principle," Momo said, though she was smiling as she said it, "even if your methodology leans heavily towards sugar content." "Methodology gets results," Mina said cheerfully, unbothered. "Look how much he's smiling. That's data, Momo. Real data." Izuku was smiling, in fact, more freely than he often allowed himself in public, caught up in the easy warmth of an evening that asked nothing of him beyond simple enjoyment. It struck him, watching Mina haggle cheerfully over a stall's last serving of grilled skewers while Momo attempted, with limited success, to explain proper negotiation tactics, that he had spent so many years of his life bracing for disappointment that he had never fully learned how to simply enjoy an ordinary evening among people who liked him for no reason beyond liking him. Momo walked beside him on the way back to the dormitory after Mina peeled off toward her own room, the night market's noise fading behind them into the quieter hum of the residential streets. "Tsuyu mentioned you spent the morning at the pond with her," Momo said. "I hope the day gave you something useful, even if it looked nothing like your usual idea of useful." "It did," Izuku admitted. "I think I forget sometimes that rest is part of getting stronger too, not just extra training hours. You and Tsuyu and Mina keep reminding me of that, actually. More than I probably deserve." "You deserve exactly as much patience and care as anyone else," Momo said, a quiet firmness entering her voice that brooked no argument. "Perhaps more, given how little of either you were shown before UA. I hope, in time, you come to expect it rather than being surprised by it every time it's offered." They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the city settling into its evening rhythm around them, and Izuku found himself thinking, not for the first time that summer, that whatever the hidden power had awakened in him on that ordinary afternoon in the drainage culvert, it was these quieter moments, these small acts of chosen kindness from people who owed him nothing, that had done far more to make him feel like someone worth being a hero for. Summer training camp began the following week, a joint venture between Class 1A and the Wild Wild Pussycats, a veteran team of rescue specialists whose mountain facility promised a full 7 days of quirk refinement away from the comforts of the dormitory. Izuku packed his bag with the same meticulous care he applied to everything, notebook included, though he suspected this particular trip would generate more memories than notes. The mountain terrain proved an ideal proving ground for the hidden powers range, forests thick enough to test precision, cliffs steep enough to test restraint, and the Pussycats' own quirks calibrated to push every student well past their comfort zone. Mandalay, the team's telepathic leader, took a particular interest in Izuku's training regimen after observing his output curve during an early exercise. "Your control has improved dramatically since the assessment reports I reviewed before this trip," Mandalay told him, watching him split a boulder with exactly enough force to crack it without scattering debris across the surrounding forest. "Most young heroes plateau around this stage. You have not." "I've had a lot of help," Izuku said honestly, glancing toward where Momo was working through her own drills a short distance away, meticulously creating and testing objects of increasing structural complexity under the watchful eye of another pussycat instructor. The evenings at camp softened into something closer to genuine rest, the exhausted students gathering around a shared fire pit to trade stories and nurse sore muscles before the next day's exertion began anew. It was during one such evening, on the third night, that Mina found Izuku sitting slightly apart from the main group, staring into the flames with the particular stillness he wore when working through a difficult thought. "You've got your thinking face on," she said, dropping down beside him without waiting for permission, a habit he had come to find comforting rather than presumptuous. "What's rattling around in there tonight?" "Just thinking about how different this feels from a year ago," he admitted. "Back then I would have watched everyone else train from a distance and told myself it wasn't for me. Now I'm actually here, actually part of it, and some days I still can't quite believe it's real." "It's real," Mina said firmly, bumping her shoulder against his the way she often did when she wanted a point to land without excessive sentimentality. "And for what it's worth, None of us think of you as someone who just showed up late to the party. You've earned every bit of this as much as anyone with a quirk since birth. More, honestly, considering everything you had to figure out on your own first. Tsuyu joined them a few minutes later, settling on Izuku's other side with a small container of night-caught insects she had gathered for reasons she declined to fully explain, and the three of them sat together in comfortable quiet until Momo finished her own evening drills and drifted over to complete the circle, brushing dust from her training uniform with characteristic precision even after a full day of exertion. I overheard part of that, Momo admitted, a faint blush coloring her cheeks as she took a seat beside Izuku. I hope you know the sentiment is shared. Watching your progress this year has been genuinely remarkable to witness up close. The moment was interrupted, as most quiet moments at UA tended to be, by a distant commotion near the camp's outer perimeter, a training exercise gone briefly sideways involving a classmate's overzealous quirk activation and a startled flock of nesting birds. The four of them laughed together as the chaos resolved itself without injury, and Izuku found himself thinking, not for the first time that summer, that the version of himself who had once cried alone in his room over a doctor's verdict would never have believed a night like this was possible. The final days of camp passed in a blur of refined technique and deepening friendship, each of them leaving the mountain not just physically stronger but woven more tightly into a found family none of them had set out deliberately to build. It had simply happened, the way real connection tends to, in small moments accumulated patiently over shared struggle and shared laughter alike. The Public Hero Showcase, an annual event held in the capital's largest stadium where licensed pro heroes performed coordinated rescue demonstrations for a crowd of tens of thousands, had never before included student participants. This year, in recognition of the exceptional performances at the sports festival, UA had been invited to send a small delegation to assist in a live evacuation drill, and honor Class 1A's top performers accepted with equal parts pride and nervous anticipation. Izuku, Momo, Tsuyu, and Mina were among those selected, alongside Aizawa serving as chaperone and Edshot present as a courtesy given his ongoing mentorship of Izuku specifically. The morning of the event dawned clear and bright, the stadium already filling with families and hero enthusiasts hours before the scheduled demonstration, entirely unaware that the letter Aizawa had received weeks earlier had proven grimly accurate in its warning. The attack came during the demonstration's opening minutes, a coordinated strike by the regrouped villain coalition that had scattered from the USJ incident, now numbering in the dozens and led by lieutenants operating under Shigaraki's distant direction. Smoke bombs detonated across multiple stadium entrances simultaneously, sowing panic among the crowd even as villains with disruptive quirks began forcing their way toward the packed stands. Evacuation protocol, now. Aizawa's voice cut through the chaos over the students' comm units, already moving to intercept the nearest threat. Izuku, Momo, Tsuyu, Mina, you clear the east concourse. Do not engage unless civilians are in direct danger. Rescue first. They moved as a unit, the instinct built across months of shared training taking over where individual panic might otherwise have set in. Tsuyu's long tongue snapped a fleeing child clear of a collapsing scaffold before it struck ground. Mina's acid quirk dissolved a locked emergency exit that had jammed under the crowd's frantic pressure, and Momo produced rope and stretchers on demand for a stream of injured bystanders faster than the arriving paramedics could keep pace with. Izuku held the concourse's central choke point, the hidden power flooding through him in the same sustained, controlled burst he had learned to summon under Edshot's guidance, catching falling debris, redirecting a stampeding crowd around a hazard rather than through it, holding a support beam steady long enough for an entire tour group of elderly visitors to clear a partially collapsed stairwell. A villain broke through the chaos directly toward him, quirk manifesting as compressed shockwaves fired from both palms, clearly intent on testing the student whose earlier heroics had circulated widely enough online to draw unwanted attention from the coalition's leadership. Izuku met the first blast head-on, absorbing the impact through careful bracing rather than reckless force, and answered with a single restrained strike that ended the confrontation before it could escalate into something the crowded concourse could not safely absorb. By the time the arriving pro-heroes finished sweeping the stadium and the villain coalition retreated in disarray, the East Concourse had been fully evacuated without a single serious casualty, a fact that would later earn all four students a formal commendation from the event organizers and a considerably less formal but far more heartfelt hug from Aizawa, who rarely showed such open relief in front of his students. You did exactly what I asked, he told them afterward, in the relative quiet of the stadium's medical tent, checking each of them over for injuries with brisk efficiency that did not quite disguise his genuine concern. Rescue first, restraint over force. That is precisely the instinct this profession requires, and precisely the instinct too many heroes never fully learn. Izuku sat on the edge of a medical cot afterward, exhausted in the particular way that came from channeling every ounce of the hidden power's sustained output for the better part of an hour, and found Momo settling beside him with a bottle of water she pressed gently into his hands. You held that beam for 6 full minutes, she said quietly, watching him drink. I timed it, out of concern rather than idle curiosity. That is an extraordinary demonstration of control, Izuku. I hope you recognize that about yourself, even amid everything else happening today. I couldn't have done any of it without knowing you three had the rest covered, he said honestly, meeting her eyes for a moment longer than strictly necessary before glancing away, flustered by something in her expression he did not yet have a name for. That's not modesty. It's just true. Tsuyu and Mina found them a few minutes later, both bearing minor scrapes and identical expressions of relieved exhaustion, and the four of them sat together in the medical tent's quiet corner while the stadium slowly returned to order outside, none of them quite ready to voice how close the day had come to disaster, all of them grateful beyond words that it had not. The weeks following the stadium attack brought a wave of media attention Izuku had not fully anticipated, footage of the East Concourse rescue circulating widely enough that hero analysts began speculating openly about his professional prospects long before graduation. He found the attention uncomfortable in ways his months of training had not prepared him for, though his mother's tearful pride when she called after seeing the coverage went a long way towards softening the discomfort. I always knew, Inko told him over the phone, her voice thick with emotion she made no effort to hide. Even when the doctors said what they said, some part of me always knew you would find your way to this. I am so proud of you, Izuku. I hope you know that. UA's administration, meanwhile, treated the incident with the gravity it deserved, tightening security protocols and opening a formal investigation into the coalition's resurgence, one that Aizawa assured the involved students would proceed without requiring their further direct involvement. The villains responsible for the stadium attack had scattered back into hiding, their leadership structure still largely intact despite the failure of their public demonstration, a fact that left a quiet undercurrent of unresolved tension humming beneath the school's otherwise triumphant mood. Izuku tried not to dwell on that tension too heavily, choosing instead to focus on the tangible, present good the past months had brought him, a hidden power fully claimed and increasingly mastered, a provisional license earned through genuine merit, and a circle of friends who had become, without any single dramatic turning point he could point to, something closer to family than he had ever expected to find outside his own mother's apartment. On a quiet evening near the end of the term, the four of them gathered once more on the dormitory rooftop, the same spot where they had celebrated their licenses months earlier, now carrying the weight of a shared brush with real danger alongside the lighter joy of that earlier evening. The city stretched out beneath them exactly as it had before, lights glittering in familiar patterns, though Izuku found himself looking at the view with a slightly different understanding of what it meant to protect something so vast and vulnerable. A year from now, Mina said, breaking a companionable silence, do you think we'll even recognize ourselves? Because I feel like I've changed more in the last 12 months than in my whole life before UA. I hope we recognize the important parts, Tsuyu said, ever the thoughtful one among them. The parts that made us want to do this in the first place, Ribbit. I'd hate to become someone who forgot why any of this mattered. I don't think that's a risk for any of us, Momo said, glancing toward Izuku with a warmth she no longer bothered to fully disguise. Not with people like this to remind each other, whenever the reasons start to feel distant. Izuku said nothing for a long moment, simply absorbing the quiet certainty of the three people beside him, the weight of a hidden power now fully his own resting easy in his chest rather than the frightened, uncontrolled thing it had once been. He thought of the boy who had sat crying over a doctor's verdict, who had believed for years that greatness belonged to other people, and felt an overwhelming gratitude for every step that had carried him from that boy to this rooftop, this moment, this family he had never expected to find. Whatever comes next, he finally said, Dylan Coalitions, the license exam ranking, whatever it turns out to be, I think we're ready for it. Together, I mean. I don't think I'd trust facing any of it without you three beside me. Below them, unseen in the gathering dusk, the coalition's scattered lieutenants were already regrouping in a hidden compound 2 prefectures away, drawing up new plans for a target far more ambitious than a single public event, plans that would soon draw Class 1A into a confrontation larger than any of them had yet faced. But atop the quiet dormitory roof, beneath a sky slowly filling with stars, 4 friends allowed themselves one more peaceful evening before whatever waited for them next, certain only that they would face it as they had faced everything so far, together, and unafraid. Izuku thought back, as he often did in quiet moments like this one, to the notebook still tucked in his desk drawer downstairs, its pages full of a younger boy's careful analysis of heroes he had once believed he could only ever admire from a distance. He no longer needed that notebook the way he once had. He had traded the fantasy of being a hero for the harder, richer work of actually becoming one, mistakes and fractured bones and hard-won victories included, and he would not have traded a single page of that real story for the safer, smaller dream he had once settled for instead. Whatever the coalition was planning in whatever hidden compound they now occupied, he found he was not afraid to meet it, not with Momo's careful precision, Tsuyu's steady calm, and Mina's fierce warmth anchoring him on every side. The hidden power that had once terrified him with its sudden violence now felt, for the first time, entirely and comfortably his own. Aizawa read the intelligence report twice before calling an emergency staff meeting, and twice more before he decided how much of it to share with his students. The coalition that had regrouped after the USJ incident, the same loose network responsible for the stadium attack, had spent the intervening weeks consolidating under a single new figure, someone the report referred to only by the designation cipher, whose quirk allowed the encryption and transmission of stolen information across vast distances without detection. Cipher had apparently spent months quietly extracting security schematics from 3 separate hero agencies, including the one currently mentoring Izuku Midoriya. They are not interested in another public spectacle, Aizawa told the assembled staff, his voice flat with the particular exhaustion of a man who had seen too many villain escalations to be surprised by this one. They are interested in infrastructure. Agency vaults, support company prototypes, anything that gives them a tactical edge for whatever comes next. Edshot's agency is on the shortlist. The news reached Izuku 2 days later, delivered by Edshot himself during a quiet debrief at the agency's downtown office, the hero's usual composed demeanor carrying an undertone of genuine concern. They have been probing our systems for weeks, Edshot explained. Subtle intrusions, nothing that triggered immediate alarm on its own, but taken together the pattern is unmistakable. I want you prepared, not frightened. There is a difference, and I intend for you to understand it fully before this resolves. Izuku absorbed the warning with the same methodical seriousness he applied to everything hero-related, filling 3 fresh pages of his notebook with hypothetical scenarios and countermeasures before Momo gently confiscated the notebook during their evening study session, insisting he eat dinner before exhausting himself over threats that had not yet materialized. Worrying in advance does not make you more prepared, she told him, not unkindly, sliding a plate across the table. Preparation makes you more prepared. There is a meaningful difference, and I would like you to actually eat something before you collapse trying to solve a problem that has not fully revealed its shape yet. I know, Izuku admitted, accepting the plate with a rueful smile. It's just hard to turn it off once it starts. I keep thinking about what happens if I miss something important because I wasn't paying close enough attention. Then let the rest of us help carry that weight, Momo said simply. That is what we are here for, is it not? You do not have to catalog every possible danger alone anymore. Tsuyu and Mina arrived a few minutes later, drawn by the smell of dinner and the promise of company, and the conversation drifted naturally away from villain coalitions and encrypted intrusions toward the ordinary rhythms of dormitory life, homework deadlines, and upcoming class assignments and Mina's increasingly elaborate plans for the coming cultural festival. It was, Izuku reflected as the evening wound down, precisely the kind of grounding presence he had spent years without, and precisely the reason the looming threat felt more manageable than it might have otherwise. Second year at UA had begun only a month earlier, but the shift in atmosphere from first year was already unmistakable, upperclassmen treated with greater independence and correspondingly greater expectation, hero work studies replacing the more tightly supervised internship structure, coursework growing denser as graduation edged closer on the horizon. Izuku found himself, more often than not, grateful for the steadying presence of three friends who had grown from classmates into something considerably more central to his daily life than he had ever quite planned for. That night, after Tsuyu and Mina had returned to their own rooms and Momo lingered a moment longer than usual at his door, she paused before leaving, her expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Whatever this coalition intends," she said, "I want you to know I do not intend to let you face it carrying more than your fair share alone. None of us do. I hope you have come to trust that, even when the old habit of shouldering everything yourself resurfaces." "I'm working on it," Izuku said, and meant it. Every day, a little more. The strike came on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks into the heightened alert, when Cypher's forces breached Edshot's agency through a service tunnel the security schematics had mapped in exhaustive detail. Izuku was on site for a routine evening patrol shift, alongside 2 junior pro heroes, when the building's alarm system failed silently, disabled from within before a single villain set foot past the perimeter. He noticed the wrongness before any alarm could have told him, a subtle shift in the ambient hum of the building's climate systems that his months of attentive training had taught him to register instinctively. "Something's off," he said quietly into his comm unit, already moving toward the archive wing where the agency's most sensitive material was housed. "The building feels different. I don't think this is nothing." His instincts proved correct within seconds, as 6 armored figures emerged from the service tunnel access point, moving with the disciplined coordination of a team that had rehearsed this exact infiltration many times over. Izuku recognized the tactical precision immediately as something well beyond typical opportunistic villainy, and understood, with a cold certainty, that this was Cypher's operation unfolding exactly as the intelligence reports had warned. He engaged the lead figure directly, buying time for the junior heroes to seal the archive's inner vault and alert the wider agency network, channeling the hidden power into a series of precisely calibrated strikes designed to incapacitate rather than merely repel. The villain's quirk, some manner of localized density manipulation, made each exchange bruising even through careful restraint, but Izuku's months of refined control held steady where raw power alone might have faltered. "You're the kid from the footage," the villain said, grudging respect edging into his otherwise hostile tone as he circled for another approach. "Cypher said you might be here. Said to be careful. Guess that was good advice. Then maybe you should take the rest of it and leave," Izuku said, planting his feet as the villain lunged again, meeting the attack with a controlled counter that sent the man staggering back against the corridor wall, momentarily stunned. "Whatever you're looking for isn't worth what you'll lose trying to take it." The remaining 5 villains split their approach, 3 pressing toward the vault while 2 doubled back to reinforce their fallen companion, and for several tense minutes Izuku found himself alone against superior numbers in a narrow corridor with no reinforcements yet arrived. He held the choke point with the same disciplined restrained Edshot had spent a year drilling into him, positioning himself to minimize collateral damage to the surrounding structure while denying the villains any clean path forward. Backup arrived 12 minutes later in the form of Edshot himself, alerted by the junior hero's emergency call, folding through the corridor's tight confines with the fluid, elongating speed his quirk allowed and neutralizing 2 villains before they fully registered his arrival. Between the 2 of them, the remaining infiltrators were subdued and restrained within another 5 minutes, the archive vault intact, its contents unbreached. "You held that corridor alone against 5 opponents for 12 minutes, Edshot said afterward, surveying the scene with an expression that mixed professional assessment and genuine pride. "That is not a small thing, Izuku. Most licensed professionals twice your age would have struggled to manage that outcome." "I just did what you taught me," Izuku said, breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing through his system. "Hold the position, deny the path, wait for support. It worked because you prepared me for exactly this." The captured villains, questioned in the following days, confirmed what the intelligence reports had already suggested. Cypher's operation extended well beyond this single agency, a coordinated campaign targeting multiple sites across the city in pursuit of information and resources for a larger, still unrevealed purpose. The investigation that followed would occupy law enforcement and the pro-hero community for weeks, but for Izuku, the immediate aftermath brought a different kind of reckoning, the sobering realization that the coalition considered him significant enough to warrant specific warning among its own ranks. Class 1B's Atsuka Kendo found Izuku a few days later outside the main lecture hall, once the immediate shock of the infiltration had settled into calmer, more reflective conversation across both years, her usual composed leadership manner tempered by genuine concern as she fell into step beside him. "I heard about last night," she said. "The whole year's talking about it already. I wanted to check on you myself, rather than just take the rumor mill's word for how you're actually doing." "I'm okay," Izuku said, appreciating the directness of the gesture. "Tired, mostly. It was a long night." "I imagine so," Kendo said. "For what it's worth, 1B's been talking about setting up some joint training sessions with your class, now that both years are deep enough into hero work studies to benefit from comparing notes. Incidents like last night make the case for it even stronger, honestly. We should be building those connections before we need them in a real crisis, not scrambling to make them afterward." "That's a good idea," Izuku said, turning the suggestion over with genuine interest. "I'd want Momo and the others in on the planning too, if we actually pursue it. They'd have good instincts about how to structure something like that." "Naturally," Kendo said, a knowing half-smile touching her expression. "Everyone's noticed how the four of you operate together at this point. I think it's a good model, honestly. Sets a decent example for the rest of us about what real trust between teammates is supposed to look like." The joint training proposal took shape over the following weeks, Kendo and Momo coordinating schedules and exercise formats between their respective classes with an efficiency that quickly earned the approval of both years' homeroom teachers. The first combined session, a coordinated disaster response drill run jointly across both classes, revealed strengths in each group's approach that neither had fully appreciated in isolation, and by its conclusion, the rigid boundary between the two classes had softened considerably into something closer to a shared, extended community. "I like this a lot more than I expected to," Mina admitted afterward, comparing notes with several of her 1B counterparts over post-drill refreshments. "Feels less like competition and more like just, more people on the same team, honestly." "That's rather the point," Kendo said, joining the conversation with an easy grin. "None of us are meant to do this work in isolation forever. Might as well start building those wider bonds now, while the stakes are still low enough to learn comfortably from each other's mistakes." Izuku, watching the two classes mingle with a warmth he found genuinely moving, thought back to his own early fear of never belonging anywhere at all, and felt, once again, the quiet, persistent gratitude that had become such a steady undercurrent to his life at UA. Belonging, he had learned, was rarely handed to anyone all at once. It was built, patiently, session by session, honest conversation by honest conversation, until one day the isolation that had once seemed permanent simply ceased to describe him at all. News of the agency infiltration reached the UA dormitory before Izuku himself did, the story breaking across hero news outlets within the hour, and he returned that night to find Momo, Tsuyu, and Mina waiting in the common room despite the late hour, all three having abandoned any pretense of studying once the alert reached their phones. "You held them off alone," Momo said, her usual composure fraying at the edges as she crossed the room to meet him, checking him over for injuries with an urgency that made his chest tighten with something warm and unfamiliar. "For 12 minutes, according to the reports." 12 minutes, Izuku, against 5 opponents, without backup. "I'm okay," he said, gently catching her hands as they continued their anxious inspection of his arms and shoulders. "A few bruises, nothing recovery girl needs to fix. Ed shot got there before it turned into anything worse." "You could have called for help sooner," Tsuyu observed, though her flat tone carried an unmistakable undercurrent of relief rather than accusation. "There's a difference between brave and reckless," Ribbit. "I hope you know which side of that line you were closer to tonight." "I know," Izuku admitted. "I didn't have time to call before they were already inside. By the time I registered what was happening, holding the corridor was the only option that kept the vault safe. I wasn't trying to be a hero about it. It just turned into the only choice that made sense." Mina, uncharacteristically quiet through the exchange, finally spoke, her usual bright energy subdued into something more raw. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if backup hadn't made it in time," she said. "I know that's not fair to you, imagining the worst case when you're standing right here fine. But it's hard not to, after a night like tonight." "I think about that too, sometimes," Izuku admitted quietly, surprising himself with the honesty of it. "Every time something like this happens. I don't know how to promise you it won't ever be that bad someday. I wish I could. We're not asking for a promise like that, Momo said, still holding one of his hands, apparently unwilling to release it now that she had confirmed for herself that he was truly unharmed. We are only asking that you let us stand beside you when it happens, rather than facing it as though you are somehow obligated to carry it alone. That much, I think, you can promise. He looked at the three of them, gathered in the dim common room well past curfew, each carrying a different flavor of the same fierce concern, and felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with adrenaline or exhaustion. I can promise that, he said. I want to promise that, actually. I just have to keep reminding myself it's allowed. It's more than allowed, Mina said, some of her usual brightness returning as the tension finally eased from the room. It's basically mandatory at this point. You're stuck with us, Midoriya. Might as well accept it fully. The laughter that followed, soft and genuine, carried them through the rest of that anxious night, for friends settled together in a common room slowly emptying of fear and refilling instead with the quiet, steady comfort of people who had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to stand beside one another through whatever came next. The investigation into Cypher's operation widened considerably over the following weeks, drawing in specialized units from the Hero Public Safety Commission and revealing a scope far larger than the initial agency infiltrations suggested. Cypher, it emerged, was not simply gathering intelligence for its own sake, but assembling a comprehensive map of the city's hero response infrastructure, ostensibly in preparation for some coordinated action still shrouded in mystery even to the investigators piecing the fragments together. UA itself became a subject of heightened concern once analysts confirmed that several of the compromised agencies maintained data-sharing partnerships with the school's own hero course curriculum, meaning student records, training schedules, and even dormitory layouts existed somewhere within the broader network Cypher had been quietly mapping for months. Nizu called an all-hands assembly to address the concern directly, his characteristic calm doing little to fully dispel the unease rippling through the student body. We do not yet know the full extent of what has been compromised, Nizu told the assembled hero course students, his small, precise voice carrying easily across the auditorium despite its lack of volume. What we do know is that this institution has weathered worse threats than an information campaign, and will continue to do so, provided every one of you continues to trust the systems and people around you rather than allowing fear to fracture that trust. Izuku listened with particular attention, aware that his own profile had likely drawn specific scrutiny from Cypher's network given the villain's earlier acknowledgement of his reputation. He found himself, in the days that followed, unconsciously more watchful during ordinary class transitions, more attentive to unfamiliar faces near the dormitory gates, a low hum of vigilance that Momo noticed within the first week and gently but firmly addressed. You cannot maintain that level of alertness indefinitely without exhausting yourself, she told him during a quiet evening study session, closing his notebook with a decisive gesture that startled him out of yet another spiral of contingency planning. The security team has this well in hand. Your responsibility right now is your own training and your own well-being, not personally anticipating every possible angle of attack. I know that logically, Izuku said, rubbing at his eyes with the particular fatigue of someone who had slept poorly for several nights running. It's just hard to switch that part of my brain off once it starts running. Then let me help you switch it off, Momo said, a faint blush coloring her cheeks even as she pressed forward with unusual directness. Come with me. There is a garden on the school's east grounds that very few students seem to know about, and I find it considerably more effective than any notebook at settling an overactive mind. He went, more out of curiosity than conviction, and found a small, carefully tended courtyard tucked behind the botany department's greenhouse, quiet enough that the campus's usual evening noise faded into a distant hum. Momo settled onto a stone bench with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent considerable time in this exact spot, and Izuku sat beside her, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin, gradually, to unwind. I come here whenever the pressure of everything feels like too much to hold at once, she admitted, watching the last of the evening light fade behind the greenhouse glass. My family has always expected a great deal of me. Sometimes it helps to simply sit somewhere quiet and remember that I am allowed to exist as more than a sum of expectations. I don't think I've ever heard you talk about that kind of pressure before, Izuku said, surprised by the vulnerability in her tone. You always seem so composed about everything. Composure is not the same as ease, Momo said, a small, wry smile touching her lips. I have simply had a great deal of practice presenting one without necessarily possessing the other. I suspect you understand that particular skill better than most people I know. He did understand it, more than he had ever articulated aloud, and something about sharing that unspoken understanding with her, in the quiet of a garden neither had expected to visit that evening, felt like a small but significant step past the careful boundaries they had both maintained since the first day of class. The garden behind the botany department's greenhouse became, over the following weeks, a quiet fixture of Izuku and Momo's shared evenings, a place neither of them advertised to the wider class but neither felt any particular need to hide either. It was simply theirs, in the way certain places become inseparable from the people who choose to return to them again and again. I used to think composure meant never allowing anyone to see the effort behind it, Momo admitted one such evening, watching the last light fade behind the greenhouse glass. My family raised me to believe that visible struggle was itself a kind of failure. It has taken me a great deal of time, and a great deal of patient company, to unlearn that particular lesson. For what it's worth, I think the effort is the impressive part, Izuku said. Anyone can look calm when nothing's actually testing them. It's a lot harder to stay steady when something genuinely is, and still let the people around you see that it's hard. That takes more courage than pretending it isn't. Momo was quiet for a long moment, turning the observation over with the same careful precision she applied to everything that mattered to her. I do not think anyone has ever framed it that way to me before, she said finally. I find I rather like the framing. Thank you. You don't have to thank me for noticing something true, Izuku said, a little embarrassed by the sincerity of her gratitude. I just pay attention. You make that easy, honestly. You're worth paying attention to. The compliment, simple as it was, brought a flush to Momo's cheeks that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air, and the silence that followed carried a warmth neither of them felt any particular urgency to fill with further words. It was, Izuku had come to realize, one of the quiet gifts of whatever this growing connection between them had become, the freedom to simply exist together, without performance, without the anxious need to fill every space with proof of worth. He found himself thinking, walking back toward the dormitory once the garden's evening chill finally became too persistent to ignore, of how different this quiet contentment felt from the frantic, striving hope that had once defined so much of his childhood. He no longer needed to earn his place among people who cared for him. He simply had it, freely given, and the difference between those two ways of existing in the world felt, more with each passing week, like the truest measure of how far he had come. Hero work studies resumed their normal rhythm even as the cipher investigation continued in the background, and Izuku found his placement with Ed Shot expanding into more substantial field responsibility as the agency's leadership recognized the maturity he had demonstrated during the infiltration incident. It was during one such expanded assignment, a joint operation coordinating with several other agencies across the district, that he met Nijire Hato, a third-year student whose quirk allowed her to absorb and redirect kinetic energy in bursts of startling versatility. You're the corridor guy. Nijire greeted him with an enthusiasm that seemed entirely unfiltered by any concern for social convention, appearing at his elbow during a briefing pause with a barrage of questions trailing close behind her introduction. I heard about the whole 5-against-1 thing. Is it true you held them for 12 full minutes? What does your power actually feel like when you use it for that long? Does it get harder to control the longer you sustain it, or does it actually get easier once you find the rhythm? Izuku found himself laughing despite the exhaustion of the day's earlier drills, caught off guard by her rapid-fire curiosity in a way that reminded him, not unpleasantly, of his own habit of asking too many questions at once. It gets easier to sustain once I find the rhythm, he admitted, answering as best he could keep pace. The hardest part is the first 30 seconds or so, before my body settles into the output level I need. That tracks with how my own quirk behaves under sustained use, Nijire said, nodding with genuine interest rather than idle small talk. I bet we'd learn a lot comparing notes properly sometime, if you're up for it. Third years don't usually get much chance to work alongside second years this closely, so I want to make the most of it while I can. The comparison sessions that followed over the next several weeks proved genuinely valuable, Nijire's third-year perspective offering Izuku insight into advanced quirk management techniques he had not yet encountered in his own coursework, while his own methodical approach to control and restraint gave her fresh language for articulating instincts she had developed but never fully broken down into repeatable technique. Momo, watching one such session from the sidelines during a shared training slot, found herself smiling at the easy camaraderie that had developed between the two, though a small, private part of her noted the observation with something closer to fond amusement than concern. She trusted Izuku's growing circle of connections implicitly, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not begrudge the space he made for new friendships even as her own feelings toward him continued to deepen in ways she had not yet found the courage to name aloud. "You two make an interesting study pair," she observed afterward, as Nijire departed toward her own dormitory with a cheerful wave. "I do not think I have seen you talk through technical detail with quite that much unfiltered enthusiasm since our own earliest study sessions together. She reminds me a little of myself, actually," Izuku admitted, a touch of self-conscious humor in his tone. "Before I learned to slow down and explain things one thought at a time instead of 5 at once." "I found the resemblance rather charming, in truth," Momo said, and something in the warmth of her expression as she said it lingered with Izuku long after the training grounds had emptied for the evening, a quiet, private acknowledgement neither of them fully addressed aloud but both, in their own way, had begun to understand. The cultural festival arrived in early autumn. UA's campus transformed over the course of a single frantic week into a sprawling celebration of student projects, performances, and elaborate class exhibitions, each year group competing informally for the honor of the festival's most memorable contribution. Class 1A settled, after considerable debate, on a hands-on rescue simulation exhibit, allowing festival visitors to experience a scaled-down version of the disaster training scenarios the Hero Course students trained through regularly. Izuku found himself assigned to security detail alongside several classmates, a role that suited his instinctive vigilance well even amid the festival's celebratory atmosphere, while Momo took the lead on designing the exhibit's technical components and Tsuyu and Mina split their time between staffing the display and enjoying the festival's broader offerings whenever their shift schedules allowed a break. The festival's first day passed without incident, a welcome relief after weeks of heightened alert surrounding the cipher investigation, and by evening the class allowed itself a rare, unguarded celebration, gathering near the exhibit's now quiet display to share festival food and compare notes on the day's highlights. It was during this quiet interlude, as the crowds thinned and the evening light softened into gold across the campus grounds, that Momo drew Izuku aside with a quiet request for a private word. "There is something I have wanted to say for some time," she began, her usual composure noticeably strained by nerves she rarely allowed herself to display so openly. "I have found, over the course of this past year, that my regard for you has grown into something considerably beyond simple friendship. I did not intend to develop these feelings so quickly, nor so completely, but I have found myself unable to set them aside, and I did not wish to continue carrying them unspoken any longer." Izuku felt his pulse quicken, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the hidden power and everything to do with the careful, earnest honesty in her expression. "I felt something like that too," he admitted, the words coming easier than he expected once he allowed himself to say them aloud. "For a while now, actually. I just wasn't sure how to bring it up without making things complicated between all of us." "I understand that concern," Momo said, a small, relieved smile beginning to form despite her lingering nervousness. "I do not wish for anything to feel complicated between our whole group. I only wished for you to know how I feel, whatever shape that knowledge takes going forward." They did not resolve anything definitively that evening, both of them mindful of the deeper conversation such a confession deserved, one that would need to include Tsuyu and Mina rather than exist in some separate, private space apart from the found family the four of them had built together. But something had shifted, unmistakably, in the quiet space between them, a warmth neither felt any further need to hide. Tsuyu and Mina, when they rejoined the group a short while later, seemed to sense the change immediately, exchanging a glance that carried more understanding than surprise. "About time," Mina said simply, a knowing grin spreading across her face. "Honestly, the two of you have been dancing around this since roughly the second week of first year. We should talk properly," Tsuyu added, settling comfortably into the group with her usual unhurried calm. "All four of us, together, once the festival winds down." There's no reason to rush a conversation like that, bit, but there's also no reason to let it go unspoken any longer than it already has. Izuku found himself nodding, grateful beyond words for a circle of friends who could absorb even a moment as significant as this one with such easy, unshaken warmth, and felt, watching the festival lights flicker out across the darkening campus, that whatever conversations still lay ahead, he would not be facing any of them alone. The conversation Tsuyu had promised took place 3 nights later, in the quiet privacy of the dormitory common room after curfew had emptied the rest of the building into silence. The 4 of them gathered around a low table with tea Momo had prepared and a candor none of them had quite managed during the festival's busier hours. I think it would help to simply say plainly what each of us actually feels, Momo began, her earlier nervousness returning briefly before she visibly steadied herself. I have already told Izuku something of my own feelings. I do not wish for that conversation to have happened in a way that leaves either of you feeling set aside or unconsidered. I don't feel set aside, Tsuyu said, with her usual matter-of-fact honesty. I've cared about him for a long time too, in my own way, bit. I just process things more quietly than some people. She glanced, not unkindly, toward Mina, who laughed despite the obvious nerves beneath her usual bravado. Guilty as charged, Mina admitted. I've known how I felt for months and just didn't know how to say it without it feeling like I was trying to compete with you too, or ruin the group dynamic we already had going. But yeah. I care about him too. A lot, actually. Izuku sat quietly through the exchange, overwhelmed in a way that felt entirely unlike the fear he had once associated with vulnerability, listening to 3 people he trusted completely lay their feelings bare with a courage he found himself striving to match. I care about all 3 of you, he said finally, choosing his words with the same careful precision he applied to everything that mattered deeply to him. I don't know exactly what that means for the shape of things going forward, but I don't want to choose between people who have all, in their own different ways, been the reason I've become someone capable of standing in a corridor against 5 villains and believing I'd make it through. Then perhaps we do not need to force a shape onto it prematurely, Momo said gently. Perhaps it is enough, for now, to simply continue as we have been, honestly and openly, and allow whatever form this takes to reveal itself in its own time, rather than demanding immediate clarity none of us are quite ready to provide. The others agreed, readily and without visible reservation, and the conversation that followed settled into something warmer and less fraught than any of them had anticipated, for friends acknowledging openly what had long existed quietly beneath the surface of their daily lives, choosing patience and honesty over any rushed declaration none of them felt prepared to make. It was not a resolution in the traditional sense. It was, Izuku thought, something better, an honest beginning, built on trust rather than urgency. For what it's worth, Mina said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over the group, I think this is exactly the kind of thing that would have terrified me a year ago. Caring about someone this much, saying it out loud, risking it not going the way I hoped. But it doesn't feel scary right now. It just feels right. I think that's because we built something worth trusting first, Izuku said quietly, looking around at the 3 of them in the dim common room light. Before any of this, we built something solid. Everything else just grew out of that. No one disagreed, and the 4 of them lingered together well past the hour they should reasonably have retired, content in a warmth that owed nothing to grand declarations and everything to months of small, patient choices to show up for one another, again and again, without condition. The days following the common room conversation settled into a rhythm none of the 4 had quite anticipated, ordinary in its outward shape but subtly transformed underneath, glances lingering a beat longer than before, hands finding each other more readily during quiet moments between classes. Izuku found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely unafraid of a kind of vulnerability that had once seemed impossibly dangerous to risk. Mina claimed a portion of one weekend for herself, dragging Izuku toward the school's outdoor training courts under the pretense of a friendly sparring match that quickly revealed itself as an excuse for uninterrupted time together, away from the busier rhythms of shared dormitory evenings. I wanted us to have something that was just ours, she admitted, a little more earnest than her usual playful energy, once the pretense of training had given way to simply sitting together on the court's edge as the afternoon sun slanted low across the grounds. I like that idea, Izuku said, watching her fidget with uncharacteristic nervousness. What made you want to do this today specifically? Honestly? I've spent so long being the loud, confident one in the group that I sometimes worry people forget I actually mean the quieter stuff just as much as the jokes, Mina admitted. I wanted you to hear it without any of the usual noise around it. I care about you. Not just as part of the group thing we've got going. As you, specifically, in a way that scared me a little to admit at first. I hear it, Izuku said gently, reaching over to take her hand. And for what it's worth, I don't think the loud, confident part and the part that means things deeply are actually separate from each other. They're both just you, and I care about both. Mina's answering smile carried a warmth rarely visible beneath her usual bravado, and the afternoon that followed, unhurried and quiet in a way neither of them often allowed themselves, became one Izuku found himself returning to in memory long after the sun had set. Tsuyu claimed her own portion of time the following week, inviting him back to the same quiet pond where they had spent that first restful Saturday months earlier, now dressed in the deepening colors of late autumn. I don't need grand gestures to know how I feel, Ribbit, she said, settling beside him on the familiar bank. But I wanted you to know, plainly, without any of my usual understatement getting in the way. I care about you a great deal, Izuku. I have for a long time. I simply process it more quietly than Mina does. I think I've always understood that about you, Izuku said, smiling. Even before either of us said anything out loud. It's part of why being around you feels so easy. You never make me feel like I have to perform anything I'm not. That's mutual, Tsuyu said simply, and the comfortable silence that followed, filled only with the sound of wind through the reeds and the distant call of some unseen bird, felt as full and complete as any declaration either of them might have spoken aloud. Bakugo cornered Izuku outside the training gymnasium on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, arms crossed and expression carrying the particular scowl he reserved for conversations he found personally uncomfortable to initiate. Heard about the whole depot thing, he said, without preamble. Heard you held a corridor alone against 5 guys before that too. You're actually getting good, Deku. Figured I should say that before it gets weird if I wait too long. Thanks, Kaken, Izuku said, careful not to make too much of the moment, aware from long experience that acknowledging Bakugo's rare displays of genuine sentiment too directly tended to send him retreating back into gruff hostility. That means a lot, actually. Don't get sappy about it, Bakugo muttered, though the edge in his voice carried less bite than it once might have. I still think I could take you in a real fight. But I'm not gonna sit here and pretend you haven't earned whatever this is you've built for yourself. The power, the friends, all of it. You earned it the hard way, same as anybody. It was, by Bakugo's standards, practically a heartfelt speech, and Izuku recognized it as such, choosing not to press further and risk undoing whatever fragile openness had prompted it in the first place. I'd take you up on that fight sometime, he said instead, offering a genuine smile. For real, not just training exercises. Damn right you will, Bakugo said, already turning to leave, the corner of his mouth twitching upward despite his best effort to maintain his usual scowl. Don't go soft on me just because you've got a whole harem following you around now, either. I want your best when we finally settle this properly. Izuku laughed, watching his old friend stalk off across the courtyard, and felt a familiar, comfortable warmth settle over the exchange, the kind that came from watching a relationship once defined entirely by cruelty slowly, patiently reshape itself into something closer to genuine brotherhood. It had taken years, and it was far from a finished process, but the distance already covered mattered more to Izuku than either of them tended to say aloud. In the days before the depot operation was finally greenlit, UA's faculty ran the selected students through an intensive series of simulated raid scenarios, drilling coordination protocols until the movements felt less like memorized steps and more like instinct. Izuku found the preparation both reassuring and quietly nerve-wracking, aware that this operation would be the first time he and his 3 closest companions had been deliberately assigned to separate teams under genuinely high stakes. I do not like the idea of being separated from you during something this dangerous, Momo admitted during one such evening, the two of them reviewing tactical diagrams spread across her desk. I recognize the strategic logic behind the assignment. That does not make the prospect any easier to accept emotionally. I feel the same way, Izuku said. But I think that's exactly why the plan works. If we're all clustered together, we're one team's worth of coverage instead of two. Splitting up means we can actually accomplish both objectives instead of gambling everything on a single approach. I know you are right, Momo said, a rare flicker of vulnerability crossing her usually composed features. I simply wanted you to know that the fear exists, regardless of how sound the reasoning behind the plan happens to be. I do not wish to hide that from you, even when it might be easier to appear entirely unshaken. I don't want you to hide it, Izuku said gently, reaching across the desk to take her hand. I'd rather know exactly how you're feeling than have you carry it alone just to seem steady for my sake. That goes both ways, by the way. I'm nervous too. Tsuyu and Mina, gathered nearby reviewing their own assigned roles, exchanged a knowing glance at the exchange, neither commenting directly but both softening visibly at the easy honesty passing between their two companions. We're all a little scared, Mina said eventually, breaking the quiet. I think that's fine, actually. Better than pretending otherwise and letting it eat at us privately instead. Fear shared is easier to carry than fear hidden, Tsuyu agreed. We've learned that much together already, Ribbit. No reason to forget it now, right before it actually matters most. They spent the remainder of that final evening before the operation not in additional drilling, but simply together, the four of them curled into the dormitory common room's worn couch long after most of their classmates had retired for the night, drawing whatever comfort and courage they could from each other's steady presence before the demands of the following dawn arrived. Izuku slept poorly that night regardless, but he slept knowing, with a certainty that had once seemed impossible to him, that whatever the depot held in store, he would not be facing it as the frightened, uncertain boy who had once stood alone in a flooded drainage culvert. He would be facing it as part of something far larger than himself, built patiently, one honest evening at a time, over 2 full years of choosing to trust and be trusted in return. The cipher investigation reached a critical turning point in late autumn, when a joint task force finally traced the network's central data hub to an abandoned rail depot on the city's industrial outskirts, the culmination of weeks of painstaking forensic work following the fragments left behind by every prior infiltration attempt. UA's faculty, informed of the development through official channels, made the decision to include a small contingent of senior hero course students in the resulting operation, citing both the students' demonstrated capability and the direct targeting several of them had already experienced firsthand. Izuku, Momo, Tsuyu, and Mina were among those selected, alongside a handful of third years including Nijire, all placed under the direct supervision of Ed Shot and 2 other veteran pro-heroes for an operation that promised to be considerably more organized and better prepared than the chaotic skirmishes that had characterized the coalition's earlier strikes. Cypher himself is believed to be present at the depot. Ed Shot briefed them the night before the operation, spreading a tactical map across the agency's planning table. His quirk poses no direct combat threat, but his intelligence network means he will likely have contingencies prepared for exactly this scenario. Expect the unexpected. Prioritize each other's safety over any individual objective. The depot, when they arrived under cover of pre-dawn darkness, proved considerably more heavily defended than the earlier infiltration sites, a rotating perimeter of armed lookouts and a scattering of minor villains recruited or coerced into the coalition's service over the preceding months. The plan called for a coordinated, staggered breach, drawing the perimeter's attention toward a diversionary team while the primary group moved to secure the depot's central data core. Izuku's team drew the diversionary assignment, a role that put him and Mina directly in the path of the depot's most concentrated resistance while Momo and Tsuyu moved with the primary group toward the core. He felt a flicker of concern at the separation, quickly steadied by Momo's calm, reassuring look before the team split toward their assigned positions in the darkness. We've got this, Mina said beside him, her usual bravado carrying a steadying undercurrent of genuine confidence. Just like the stadium. We each do our part, and it all comes together. The diversion unfolded with brutal efficiency, Mina's acid dissolving a section of perimeter fencing while Izuku engaged the responding lookouts with the same controlled, restrained force that had become his signature, careful even amid the operation's urgency to avoid excessive harm to opponents who, in several cases, appeared to be coerced participants rather than willing villains. The chaos drew exactly the attention the plan required, buying the primary team the window they needed to breach the depot's inner structure undetected. Momo and Tsuyu reached the data core with Nijire and the accompanying pro-heroes just as Cypher himself, alerted too late to the breach, attempted to flee through a rear service exit with a portable drive containing the network's most sensitive holdings. Tsuyu's tongue caught him mid-stride, and Momo's quickly materialized restraints secured him before he could attempt any further escape, the operation's central objective achieved with minimal further resistance. By the time the perimeter fighting concluded and Izuku and Mina made their way toward the depot's interior, the operation had already effectively ended, Cypher restrained and the data core's contents secured for forensic analysis. The coalition's months-long campaign brought to a definitive close in the space of a single coordinated night. Izuku found Momo waiting near the entrance, and the relief on both their faces as they reached each other needed no further words to explain. The weeks following Cypher's capture brought a wave of formal recognition neither Izuku nor his friends had fully anticipated, commendations from the Public Safety Commission, feature coverage across every major hero news outlet, and a formal ceremony at UA itself honoring the students who had participated in the operation's successful conclusion. Nizu presided over the ceremony with characteristic understatement, though the pride in his voice as he read each student's name was unmistakable to anyone listening closely. What you accomplished was not simply the neutralization of a threat, Nizu told the assembled students and faculty. It was a demonstration of exactly the values this institution exists to cultivate: coordinated trust, restrained strength, and the willingness to stand beside one another even when the outcome remains uncertain. I could not be more pleased with what each of you has shown this term. Izuku listened to the words with a quiet, private satisfaction that felt entirely different from the anxious striving that had characterized so much of his earlier life, a satisfaction built not on proving himself worthy of a dream once denied him, but on the simple, solid knowledge that he had shown up, again and again, for people who mattered to him, and that they had shown up for him in equal measure. That evening, the dormitory hosted an informal celebration that stretched well past the usual curfew, Aizawa choosing, for once, to overlook the infraction given the circumstances. Izuku found himself pulled aside partway through the festivities by Momo, Tsuyu, and Mina together, the three of them exchanging a brief, meaningful glance before Momo spoke. We have discussed it further, the three of us, she said, and we find that we are, in fact, entirely comfortable with the shape this has taken. If you are amenable, we would like to consider ourselves openly, formally, whatever arrangement of partnership feels honest to what has grown between the four of us, rather than continuing to leave it undefined out of caution. I'd like that, Izuku said, without hesitation, warmth spreading through his chest at the easy certainty in her words. I've wanted that for a while now, honestly. I just didn't want to rush any of you into deciding before you were ready. We're ready, Mina confirmed, grinning as she looped an arm through his. Have been for a while, honestly. We just wanted to make sure it was something we built carefully, rather than something that happened by accident. It was built carefully, Tsuyu said, settling comfortably against his other side. Every step of it, ribbit. That's why it feels solid now instead of fragile. They stood together near the common room's wide windows, the campus grounds spread out below them still faintly lit by the last lingering strings of festival decoration no one had gotten around to taking down, and Izuku felt, more powerfully than at any point since a doctor's verdict had once threatened to define the entirety of his future, that he had built something real and lasting, not through the hidden power that had first set him apart, but through the patient, deliberate choice to be worthy of the people who had chosen to stand beside him. Word arrived the following week that the Public Safety Commission, in reviewing the full scope of Cypher's network, had uncovered references to a still unidentified financier believed to have funded the coalition's operations from well outside the city, someone whose interests apparently extended considerably further than a single data-gathering campaign. The investigation into that deeper thread would take months to fully unravel, UA's faculty warned, and would likely draw the school's senior students back into its orbit before it finally reached its conclusion. For now, though, Class 1A allowed itself a season of well-earned peace, for friends among them closer than ever, ready to face whatever came next exactly as they had faced everything so far, together. With Cypher's network dismantled and the immediate danger behind them, UA's hero course pressed forward with its ordinary curriculum regardless, and the approaching provisional hero rankings assessment, an evaluation that would formally rank every second-year student against their peers nationwide, occupied an increasing share of Izuku's attention as autumn deepened toward winter. The assessment carried real professional weight, agencies across the country using its results to inform early recruitment interest well ahead of graduation. Izuku approached the rankings assessment with characteristic thoroughness, filling his notebook with detailed breakdowns of the evaluation's scoring criteria, cross-referencing his own strengths and weaknesses against the metrics most likely to determine his final placement. Momo, unsurprisingly, approached her own preparation with equal rigor, and the two of them fell into an easy rhythm of shared study sessions that Tsuyu and Mina occasionally joined, though both preferred a more intuitive approach to preparation than the detailed spreadsheets Momo insisted on maintaining. "You are overthinking the tactical scenario portion," Momo told him one evening, reviewing his practice responses with a critical eye. "Your instincts are sound. You do not need to second-guess every decision through 3 additional layers of hypothetical consequence. Trust the judgment you have already built through genuine field experience." Easier said than done, Izuku admitted, though he took the feedback seriously, forcing himself in subsequent practice runs to commit to his first instinct rather than exhaustively second-guessing it. The improvement was noticeable almost immediately, his response times sharpening without any corresponding loss in the careful restraint that had become his hallmark. The assessment itself unfolded over a demanding 3 days, written evaluation followed by a series of simulated field scenarios monitored by an external panel of veteran pro heroes rather than UA's own faculty, a deliberate choice meant to ensure impartiality in the final rankings. Izuku's scenario placed him in a coordinated multi-hazard disaster simulation, testing not just raw capability but leadership judgment under genuinely ambiguous circumstances. He performed well, drawing on months of hard-won field experience rather than any single flashy display of the hidden power's raw strength, prioritizing civilian safety with the same instinctive restraint Ed Shot had spent a year cultivating in him. When the rankings were finally published a week later, Izuku found himself placed within the top 20 nationally among second-year students, a result that exceeded even his own careful expectations. Momo placed higher still, her meticulous preparation and versatile quirk earning her a top 10 national placement, a result she accepted with characteristic modesty even as the rest of the group celebrated enthusiastically on her behalf. Tsuyu and Mina, while not placing quite as highly, both scored comfortably within the upper third of the national field, results that left all 4 of them proud of a term's worth of hard-earned growth. "I keep thinking about where I would have placed a year and a half ago," Izuku said that evening, looking over the official results with something between disbelief and quiet satisfaction. "I wouldn't have placed at all. I wouldn't have had a quirk to test in the first place." "You have more than a quirk now," Momo said, resting a hand over his where it lay against the printed rankings sheet. "You have judgment, restraint, and people who believe in you enough to have helped you build both. The ranking is simply a reflection of work already done, not the source of it." He knew she was right, and the knowledge settled over him with a warmth that no ranking, however impressive, could have provided on its own. Winter break brought a brief, welcome respite from academic pressure, and Izuku spent a portion of the holiday introducing Momo, Tsuyu, and Mina individually to his mother, a series of visits Inko approached with barely contained delight that Izuku found both endearing and mildly mortifying in equal measure. "He talked about all 3 of you so much before he worked up the nerve to actually say anything," Inko confided cheerfully to Momo during her visit, pulling out an embarrassing selection of childhood photographs before Izuku could intervene. "I kept telling him good things come to those who are patient, and honest, and kind. It seems I was right." "Mom," Izuku groaned, though the warmth in his voice undercut any real protest, watching Momo laugh openly at his expense for what felt like the first time since he had known her, a sound he found he wanted to hear far more often. Tsuyu's visit unfolded with quieter warmth, Inko and Tsuyu discovering a shared interest in gardening that occupied most of the afternoon while Izuku looked on, content simply to watch 2 people he cared about deeply find their own easy rapport without any need for his involvement. Mina's visit, predictably, brought considerably more noise and laughter, Inko delighting in Mina's boundless energy in a way that left Izuku's small apartment feeling, for one bright afternoon, fuller than it had in years. "They're wonderful, all 3 of them," Inko told him quietly, after Mina's visit had wound down and the apartment had settled back into its familiar evening quiet. "I am so glad you found people who see you exactly as you are, Izuku. That was always the thing I worried about most, when you were small and the world seemed so determined to convince you that you were less than you actually were. I found them because you never let me stop believing I deserved to look, Izuku said, and the quiet, tearful hug that followed carried the weight of every hard year that had led, patiently and imperfectly, to this one. The break ended too quickly, as breaks always did, and the four of them returned to the dormitory in early January, the rankings assessment behind them, the wider world's remaining unfinished business still waiting somewhere ahead in the unwritten shape of the term to come. The deeper thread the Public Safety Commission had flagged in the wake of Cypher's capture surfaced sooner than anyone at UA had anticipated, emerging not from further investigation into the dismantled network but from an entirely separate lead. A routine customs inspection at the city's northern port that flagged an unusually sophisticated shipment of quirk suppression technology traced back through a shell company registry to a name that made Nizu's ever-present smile falter for the first time any of the assembled staff could recall. The registry traces to a consortium operating under the name Meridian Holdings, Nizu explained during the faculty briefing that Aizawa relayed, in careful summary, to the students most directly involved in the Cypher operations conclusion. Publicly, a legitimate investment firm. Privately, we now have reasonable evidence connecting it to funding behind at least 4 separate villain operations across the past 3 years, Cypher's network among them. What do they actually want? Izuku asked, the familiar hum of anxious calculation already spinning up behind his eyes despite months of practice at tempering it. Cypher was after information. What's a firm like that trying to build toward with all of it combined? That, Nizu admitted, with unusual candor, we do not yet fully know. Which is precisely why this investigation will continue well beyond this term, and precisely why I do not intend to involve students further until we understand considerably more than we currently do. You have all done more than could reasonably have been asked of you already. The news settled over the group with a weight that tempered, without entirely extinguishing, the hard-won peace of the preceding weeks. Izuku found himself, that evening, sitting on the familiar dormitory rooftop with Momo, Tsuyu, and Mina gathered close around him, the city lights spread out below in their usual glittering carpet, now carrying a shadow of unfinished threat none of them could fully ignore. It doesn't feel like it's really over, does it? Mina said quietly, uncharacteristically subdued. Cypher was just one piece of something bigger. I don't know if I should be scared about that or just tired of it. Both, probably, Tsuyu said. That seems like the honest answer, Ribbit. But being tired of something doesn't mean giving up on it. We'll face whatever Meridian Holdings turns out to be the same way we faced Cypher. Together, and prepared, rather than either alone or unready. She's right, Momo said, leaning gently against Izuku's shoulder. Whatever comes, we have already proven, more than once now, that we are considerably stronger facing it as four than any of us would be facing it individually. I choose to hold on to that certainty rather than the fear of what remains unknown. Izuku nodded, watching the city lights flicker against the deepening winter sky, and found, despite the weight of an unresolved threat still gathering somewhere beyond his sight, that he trusted the four of them, together, to meet whatever came next. The hidden power that had once erupted from him in fear and confusion now felt, after 2 full years of patient mastery, like the least remarkable thing about the person he had become. It was the people beside him, chosen and choosing in equal measure, that had truly made him who he was. Word would not arrive for several more weeks concerning Meridian Holdings' next move, but when it finally did, in the form of an anonymous tip routed through the Public Safety Commission pointing toward a remote coastal research facility far from the capital, it would mark the beginning of a chapter in Izuku's story considerably larger and more dangerous than anything the hidden power had yet been tested against. For now, he closed his notebook, its newest pages filled less with hero statistics than with quiet reflections on everything 2 years at UA had taught him about strength, restraint, and the people worth holding close through both, and allowed himself, beside the 3 who had chosen him without condition, to rest easy in whatever came next. Thanks for listening.